Good evening, and I think this is the second fair chat for me. Uh, so I think I already introduced myself. Like it's like term for Bhagyesh from Citi. So Bhagyesh, just let us know your expertise and please introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm fully aware that we are probably the last one. So we will keep it short and to the point as well. So my name is Bhagyesh. I'm heading the data quality and stewardship function at Citi. I have been roughly over 2 decades of experience in banking. I also had opportunities to see data from a charity and a startup as well. So I kind of have that understanding of fast-paced versus heavily regulated versus a completely charity organization where there is lack of funds. So I would like to share my thoughts as well on those fronts.
I'm having Anthony as well. Anthony, just tell us about yourself, your expertise.
Thank you. I'm very aware it's the graveyard shift. So I'm Anthony Hodge. I've been working with cloud technologies now for close to a decade. Been in financial services technology, for financial services and tech for over 2 decades. Worked across various jurisdictions, various countries. And hopefully we can answer some questions here today.
So I think I can say in the current era of the data-driven organization, where the most of our decisions are data-based, and the governance is very important. Good governance will give the good data quality and then compliance. So I can say, let's start our fire chat based on the topic, how governance practice translate into growth and advancement. Bhagyesh, what do you believe are the most significant challenges in establishing effective data governance practice in BFSI industry?
Sure. So I think when you look at data governance, it's about where the data originates, how it flows, and the consumption of it ultimately, right? So there are a couple of lenses one can look at data governance. One is internal, the other one is external. Internal, you could almost look at it from a people process technology point of view. External, you could say regulations, for example. Now, what are the challenges therefore? Complexity of data is increasing. So it's increasing day by day, all sorts of data, better, faster, cheaper, all of that is happening on one hand. The other hand is large institutions like banks have a lot of legacy systems, and now they are going through that modernization journey where new technology is coming in. So that's another challenge. You could call it siloed data, for example. On top of that, you can think about structured approach to solving these problems and data literacy. Data literacy where from top, your leadership should understand the value of data governance, why it is required, what it is supposed to deliver. That's another challenge one can talk about. And finally, having those mechanisms in place which can control your data at rest and data in motion. Now, how do you go about really building this complex equation together? And where do you put the accountability? Where do you then solve the problem? What is the start of it? One way to look at it is to understand what data you have and what it should be used for, and that's where we come into this whole metadata understanding and tagging the data right so that people who are using it, folks that are using it downstream are totally aware of what they are using, but at the same time having that clear relationship of consumer and provider. From a provider perspective, transparency, that this is my data, this is what it means, this is where I get it, this is how I derive it, timeliness, quality, blah, blah, blah. On the other hand, the consumer should be able to then say that this is the data I'm going to use or I need, and this is what I will do with it. Because more often than not, consumer takes the data for one purpose, but because they had the data, they end up using it for something else, and that's where the problem starts. So I think it's a very broad topic in terms of challenges and solutions both, and the technology advancement is happening so fast where you can't bring up the whole legacy and the data you already have along with the new platforms and the new type of data that's coming in. So balancing is probably, and starting with your top priorities is going to be the start point.
Thanks, Bhagyesh. So let's move from data governance to cloud governance. So Anthony, so what are the emerging trends, Anthony, do you feel in the cloud governance side?
So with cloud, it's about regulation. There's more regulation all the time. And I think with that, that a lot of the regulations are a response to a lack of understanding about what cloud really means. Because cloud doesn't mean one thing. Cloud technologies are third party. They're either your own software development deployed into a large IaaS provider such as AWS or Azure. You could argue there are PaaS platforms, platform as a service, and but that's again third party. And then there are SaaS platforms where you're taking something and giving it to somebody else to run for you. So if you look at those different paradigms, where your border, where your perimeter stops, changes. And I think there's also a much overused phrase which people will have heard used, which is the shared responsibility model, which I tend not to agree with at all, because we don't share anything with our providers. We have a very clear contractual relationship with who does what. Nothing is shared. There's the service that you may then expose to your customer or your staff is shared, but you are responsible for X, they are responsible for Y. So what I think we're seeing is a lot of change in maturity of understanding of what these third-party relationships mean in the globe, combined with an increased focus on data localization and sovereignty in certain jurisdictions, which I think you're probably seeing as well. And that varies as well. It's not always the same. So you'll find banks in Africa have disappeared overnight. So if you're working in Africa, the African regulators are very concerned about banks disappearing, deposits disappearing, customers being impacted. If you're working with other jurisdictions, Indonesia used to say everything onshore. Now it'll say retail onshore, but everything else can go offshore, because they realize, again, they want to protect their customers and their countrymen. And then if you look at China, China's just really opaque when it comes to cloud. And the regulations aren't clear, nobody's really sure. But what we do see is that the Chinese regulator has started to apply prudential and supervisory regulation to the Tencents of the world, to the Alibabas of the world. They're still using their internally developed clouds, so there's a competitive disadvantage. But so if you see this, there's no, I think what we're seeing is no one trend, lots of different people taking different approaches. That depends on the maturity of their mindset, of their understanding. And also what we're seeing is that data sovereignty angle kicking in a few jurisdictions, which can complicate things as well. So it's a multifaceted challenge at the moment.
Thanks. So let me just shift the mode of our discussion toward the compliance practices. So Bhagyesh, to you, how do you ensure that the data governance practices compile with the regulatory requirement like GDPR, CCPA, and all?
Sure. So when you look at data governance, there are three layers you can think. So there is something called policy. Now that policy can be driven by a regulator or your own internal policy. Underneath that, the second layer is what we call a standard or reference standards. So once you have a, let's say, enterprise policy, then you develop standards underneath in terms of what does that mean, who needs to do what. Again, still high level, not an execution level yet. And underneath that, what you have is user guides or SOPs, right? So once you sort of understand that structure from a policy point of view, then it becomes much easier to adopt data governance principles around it, right? Because let's say a retail bank versus a markets or investment banking side might implement the same standard differently, because some system might be global, some system might be completely regional. And that's where you kind of start, policy will be same for everybody, standards could slightly differ, but things like having a single source of all your metadata repository could be a standard in the organization. Having a single source for all your data quality issues could be a standard as well, right? And then the implementation of these, which is the user guides and all. So that's kind of the mechanism to handle the complexity. But there are two layers of complexity, as I earlier also said, internal, external. All the ones that you said are regulatory driven, and each regulator is coming up with a version of their own when it comes to data privacy, especially on the direct data PIIs and all. So we have our own local version in Singapore. You named two of them. India has been sort of thinking about its own. And on top of that, being in a heavily regulated financial industry, there are a lot of other regulations that we have on your financials, on your risk, and so on and so forth. And all of these are driven both with your internal policies and external regulations that that you got to meet. So that's basically, those are the three layers to start peeling the onion. Implementation part is even more complex, and if you were to go there, probably much longer discussion and debate.
So I just wanted to add my experience as well, because I am working on an initiative called Data Loss Protection in DBS, where now I think there is a MAS requirement as well that data, our PI data should not flow into the cloud as a clear text. So ideally, even though we are following all the data cataloging, where the mapping is happening for the PI data, and where like it's like private or public, and this kind of mapping we do, and even though it flows to the our security system, where also one more layer of or you can say encryption happen, but there may be a chance that some leakage will be there. So that's the reason I think there is a one more check, like where the data loss protection kind of tool, which we are trying, and we'll see how we can check of this flow of information or loss of information of PI into the cloud. So this is just in addition to your thoughts, actually. So Anthony, just for you, so now let me just shift on the governance side, governance framework for the cloud. So how do you feel, what are the risks of not having the strong governance framework in place?
If you don't have a strong governance framework, you can't demonstrate that you've met all of your regulations. So, I mean, it's fairly essential, because then you'll end up with loss of banking license, sanctions, and fines, right? And then we'll all spend a lot more time with our family rather than in the office. So I think, a strong governance practice is essential. And I always think of it as there's an example in the UK years ago where government ministers were in a taxi, they'd been out for dinner, and they lost their laptops, and they'd lost their data. It was all very, very worrying. So the next thing they did, they had to start implementing SAN arrays and file backups and shared file systems, so that those things weren't exposed when people were out and about. They were back centrally held in a data center. And that was a reaction to something that went wrong because they had poor governance. So what governance tends to be a focus on governance when things go wrong. And that's okay to start with, but what that really should be showing is you then move governance into being more of a proactive, again, data-driven, right? And you can then look at the things that you're doing and show how you can provide evidence. Evidence backs up attestations, and shows that you're running a decent shop. It stops your capital adequacy barriers being increased, right? There's a lot of good things that come from good governance. What you need to do with good governance, and this is where it gets a little bit kind of difficult at times to talk about benefits and benefits realization, you need to invest in the technology that supports it in the same way that you do in any process. Because if you sit there, as we did when we started working off Excel and turning Excel into databases, because that's not what they're designed for, and you need auditable workflows, and you need systems, you need sources of truth, the same way you do for anything else. So if you back your governance up with well thought out products, you will not need to scale to lots and lots of people, because lots and lots of people lead to manual errors. And if you're putting regulatory attestations together, that's the last thing you want, is a manual error, right? So I'm a big fan of governance frameworks. I didn't understand them when I started. A lot of people don't. But then I've learned a lot about what not to do over the last 10 years. But it's an evolving space, and I think it doesn't really matter to an extent if it's cloud governance or data governance or API governance. You'll have a set of key principles that apply across the lot, and then there's the implementation. And to Bhagyesh's point, I think there's one more layer, which so you talk about policy. You have to anchor your governance in these things, right? So you have policies, you have standards, then processes, and then where people really start to get interested are the controls that you can evidence. And you've got to be a little bit careful, because people then start to look at control compliance individually, and that can be taken out of context. What you really want is a measured trade-off. What's the residual risk across a different set of controls? And that's where people can trip themselves up a bit. Right? But it's an interesting and evolving space.
Thanks, Anthony. So now, as a CDO, Bhagyesh. How do you prioritize data governance initiatives in your organization?
I think let's get there, but I wanted to add to Anthony's point, and ultimately it's about that trust and having confidence that the data is flowing right. You won't have problems, and all what you said is completely implementation is the key, so and execution will be the key. And coming to the question, where do we start, right? And how do we prioritize? And I think that's a perennial problem and not just a data governance problem as such, right? Data governance is, and I would say data is more like culture, right? So you can't really start and stop and do in one pocket and not in the other pocket, because that's not gonna really lead to the larger organizational value. You could talk about defensive data strategy or offensive data strategy. In all cases, it has to be across the board, organizationally sort of adopted principle in a way. But if you were to really, of course, nobody has infinite amount of resources, infinite budgets, and also you got to start somewhere. I would suggest start looking at the top layer or the innovation side aside. If you were to limit the downside of what you do, then start with your top key reports. It could be a risk report that you send out. It could be anything that goes out of the door must start following these governance principles so that your trust in the data from an external lens gets addressed, right? Internally, there are various things that you could do. And ultimately, it's the same lens that translates towards in the organization as well. And one example could be if you do a trade, it settles in one system, the risk gets calculated in another system, and finally it gets aggregated somewhere else. You will have to go through those internal hops for the external body to then feel comfortable, and including the internal therefore as well. So I think that's probably where you start.
Sure. Thanks, Bhagyesh. So,
there's no one size fits all, right? So if you talk to AWS or you talk to Google or you talk to Azure or you talk to some of the other smaller ones, having them, we now have to start to identify supply chain. So who are their subcontractors, right? And then actually, are they sharing subcontractors? Because Singapore and Hong Kong aren't very big, and you'll find that there are some shared subcontractors. Because at that point, these companies are so large that there are only so many other large companies that can support them. So you end up with fourth-party risk, which you may not have had. If you start using SaaS providers, and SaaS providers use AWS or Azure as their third party, as their fourth party, you end up with fifth-party supply chain risk, which didn't exist before, right? Or we really weren't aware of it. Then you move into concentration risk. And concentration risk, not necessarily from just a vendor perspective, but how many services, and it's linked to that supply chain, are serviced out of one country, for example, one geography. Because if you can disperse those, your blast radius decreases. So your operational resiliency can improve. But a lot of those things you won't find. You've got companies which have a particular DNA, and I'll call Amazon out here because they're very good, and we've been working with them for years. But they'll tell you that they won't give you their data center locations. And it's a known thing, whereas the other companies will be a bit more open. The fact they're all on WikiLeaks is irrelevant, which is the conversation we've had with them a couple of times, right? You can find it on the internet. In fact, you go to Dublin and say, can you find a taxi driver and say, can you take me to the data center? And they'll take you there. So they try to keep things secret. I think that's a good thing. It helps with security. But there's a lot of data out there already. So actually finding out how to assess your third party and at what point they will partner with you on that assessment. Originally, a lot of the cloud providers wouldn't allow you to do pen tests. Right? You had to schedule a penetration test. Now they're much more open about that. So it's finding out, again, coming back to I think policy standard process internally, what you should do within your risk appetite from an assessment of a third party. If you are going to put 25% of your workloads on a given third party, and in financial services, that used to be IBM, right, 25 years ago. One of the advantages with IBM was that you could then shape the products that they were producing, right? There's a reason for the old statement, no one ever got fired for buying IBM back in the day, because they were really innovative, right? So if you are going to put I wouldn't say all your eggs in one basket, but if you're going to put a significant effort into outsourcing to a cloud service provider, I think the level of due diligence should be commensurate. And I think you should also partner with industry bodies as well, and share that knowledge and information, because Amazon or Microsoft, their market capitalization is far larger than any particular bank, right? Well, maybe Mr. Dimmon's bank is slightly different, but most banks, the market capitalization of the cloud providers are much larger. But if you come together as an industry and you come together with the regulators and you come together with a forum, then your shared voice is heard because they want to make money out of us. So there are pragmatic approaches you can take when it comes to dealing with cloud service providers, because they will have a different approach to how transparent they will be on day one. But yeah, as I said, what we're seeing is that's helped a lot. The CSPs have never been inside the regulatory perimeter. They're not directly regulated. As an FSI, we are regulated, so we have contractual agreements with them. But then trying to execute maybe the right to audit can be a bit of a challenge. Right? So with those things in mind, as financial services regulation is shifting to kind of designate cloud service providers or critical third parties into a bit more, sweeping them into that regulatory perimeter, that's actually going to help us. That's actually going to be a significant benefit to all of us, I think. We won't have to unilaterally argue with these companies. They will know that to do business in the financial services vertical in the same way that the government vertical or the health vertical, they're going to have to operate in a certain way. I think that's the big change that I think I'm looking forward to.
Sure, thanks. So before closing our fire chat, I just want any summarization notes you wanted to share. Quick one.
I quite like the title, In Governance We Trust, right? I think we should trust in governance and we should invest in good governance procedures. Your internal audit teams are always looking for some work to do. And if they come along and speak to you and you can show that you can provide evidence, you can provide attestation, you've got the beloved of risk and governance KCIs and KRIs that are well managed and well designed, you're far less likely to have a significant overhead. Right? You're far less likely to have, we've seen it before, monitors turn up from regulators, right? Every bank's had some sort of, every bank's had a monitor at some point, right? If you can show how you're managing and how you can evidence that, you're far less likely to get that overhead, because that overhead actually makes your job twice as difficult. So invest early and upfront, think about it, think about your risk appetite, and try and remember how you're adding, or describe how you're adding value. I mean, one of the things, when you mentioned all of the internal data and the external data, I immediately started thinking to back in the day when you've got 60 systems all linked together for a flow, and every single one's got an ETL job, right? And they're all trying to transform that data as it goes through. Because each interface was brought in individually under its own project stream and its own investment budget, right? If you could take a step back, I think someone said on the previous panel about the neobanks, you'd be able to redesign that. You'd be able to say, where's my one data lake or my two data lakes? What am I doing with this data and that data? And you'd have principles for data handling, for data transformation. And if you look at things like that, you can start to say, how many man hours will I shave off per day, per week, per year, per batch? And those are material benefits to the organization. They're often under the line, so they're not, they don't turn around and give you, dollar benefits immediately. If you can show people that you're freeing up half a year of someone's time, right, you're improving batch SLAs, then that's demonstrating why governance is effective.
Thanks. Any summarization notes from you?
One statement, and I won't take it long. So in governance, we trust, but we must review. What that means is we must have the KPIs and KRIs in place, to your point as well, to build the trust in governance. I would almost put it that way. So start somewhere, but have a way to measure it as well. And yeah, it's all about that trust.
Thanks, Bhagyesh and Tony, for the session.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.